do you really know much about what you read in the Bible? And we're going to start it from the New Testament. Yeah, we're going to start the lecture from the New Testament because there's enough people think them know when they but don't know when they.
This is Mutabaruka. We want to present to you a wholesome kind of level of consciousness right now. So subscribe and tell your friend them. This is Mutabaruka.
Although much shorter than the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament still has its own complex history. Many of the books began in the oral tradition, and because many early Christians expected the second coming of Christ to happen any day, there seemed to be little need for a written version of the good news. Eventually, as the first generation of apostles who were spreading the good news started to die off, either from old age or as the result of persecutions by the Romans, it seemed like a good idea to set these words down. The letters of Paul were the first to be collected around 90 CE, and sometime after 100 CE, there was a collection of the four Gospels. There are no originals of these writings. As the early Christian church grew, the Gospels and letters were widely copied to be spread from one Christian community to the next in a day when there was no Kinko's or corner copy shop. Thousands of hand-copied versions of fairly early New Testament documents exist, and they aren't always in agreement. The concept of a New Testament, an assemblage of holy writings that added to or even replaced accepted Hebrew writings, emerged in the 2nd century CE. As with the Hebrew scriptures, there are human fingerprints all over the decision-making that led to the compilation of the New Testament. Most biblical researchers presume that other early Christian writings existed, including other letters by Paul, but they were lost or even discarded. Modern scholars also suspect that the New Testament authors had access to a collection of Jesus' sayings, a kind of 1st century Bartlett's familiar quotations, or quotations from Chairman Jesus, called Q. From the German word Quelle, for source, this Q document exists only in theory.
You are listening to the Black Radar YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button and keep listening.
If there are only 4 Gospels, then what are the Gnostic Gospels?
In a story combining a little murder mystery with some Indiana Jones intrigue, an Egyptian peasant made an extraordinary find of 13 leather-bound books in 1945. As recounted by Elaine Pagels in her prize-winning book, The Gnostic Gospels, a farmer digging near the town of Nag Hammadi, located on the Nile north of Luxor, uncovered these papyrus books in a buried earthen jar. He took them home, where his mother accidentally burned some of the papyrus as kindling. A few weeks later, this man and his brother killed another local man in a blood feud over the death of their father. Fearing that police investigating the murder would discover the books, the farmer turned his find over to a local priest. Learning of the books, a school teacher sent one to Cairo to check its value on the black market for antiquities. The Egyptian government got wind of the books and confiscated 10 and a half of the 13 books, and they were placed in a Cairo museum. But part of another book was smuggled out of Egypt and offered for sale in America. A Dutch historian and linguist heard of the books and purchased the smuggled text. Discovering that parts were missing, he flew to Cairo in 1955, where he was able to see photographic reproductions of the other books. He began to decipher them. The first words he made out were nothing short of revolutionary. These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and which the twin Judas Thomas wrote down. The words came from the Gospel according to Thomas. Although other early Christian writings were known to have existed, and scraps of a mysterious Gospel according to Thomas had been found previously, the entire text had never been seen. This new Gospel was the first of 55 texts discovered at Nag Hammadi. These were the so-called Gnostic Gospels, a secret set of early Christian writings. Written in Coptic, a North African dialect used exclusively by an Egyptian Christian sect, they proved to be 1,500-year-old translations of older Greek writings. Some of the books contained familiar sayings from the New Testament, but other teachings and statements attributed to Jesus were unique and extraordinary, potentially shaking the foundations of Christianity with the questions they raised. In one text, the Gospel of Philip, Jesus is depicted kissing Mary Magdalene, one of his female followers. It is not a brotherly peck on the cheek, either. Gnostics, an early Christian sect whose name comes from the Greek gnosis, usually translated as knowledge, is a term used loosely to identify groups of early Christians who held beliefs very different from conventional Christianity. Just as modern Christianity is split among many contending sects with differing ideas about Jesus, the early church was deeply divided. Gnostics believed, for instance, that Jesus' rising from the dead was spiritual rather than an actual physical event. They also believed in a spiritual search for inner truth that had more in common with Eastern views like Buddhism than with Orthodox Christianity. The Gnostic Gospels had been denounced as heresy by early Christian leaders who were no longer persecuted victims. They had become the authorities. To challenge them was to risk excommunication, arrest, or worse, for heresy. About 500 years after Jesus lived, someone took a set of these banned texts and buried them in the Egyptian desert, either out of self-preservation or for posterity. While the Nag Hammadi discoveries have opened up a great many questions, they also make one thing clear. The earliest Christians did not agree on what we call the New Testament, and they may have had more of Jesus' life and words to read and study than the stories and teachings familiar to most contemporary Christians. 35 years after the death of John F. Kennedy, the American president's life and death continue to fascinate the public and provide an endless source of material for biographers, historians, novelists, conspiracy theorists, and revisionist filmmakers. All make claims about the real Kennedy, who he was, what he said, and what he might have been thinking. The flood of conjecture and outright fiction continued to pour out, despite the fact that there are newspaper accounts, film and television footage, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people still alive who knew John F. Kennedy and worked with him on a daily basis. In spite of all that evidence, most people still don't know the truth about the real JFK. How then can anyone possibly get a true picture of the historical Jesus, a man who left no writings or Oval Office tape recordings? We're not even sure if the people who said they knew him really knew him, or where they got their stories if they didn't. Nevertheless, since the 19th century, and especially in recent years, it has become popular to distinguish between the Jesus of faith, as presented in the New Testament, and the historical Jesus. Just as the Hebrew Scriptures contain multiple stories of everything from the creation to King David and the destruction and rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple, there are conflicting accounts of Jesus in the New Testament. The next part of this program aims to depict the life of Jesus as it is presented in the accounts of the four Gospels, complete with contradictions.
The informative information presented in this video is motivational and is positively aimed at inspiring, educating and entertaining the viewers with the cutting edge of critical reasoning. If you enjoy the contents on the Black Radar YouTube channel, please consider subscribing to show your support.